fortuitous that we've had the discussion we have had, given the next speaker you're going to hear from before lunch. Uh, Before the speaker comes on, let me say those of you who are members of the GIC and speakers here at the forum, if you are on the advisory board of the uh, Government and Public Policy Institute, please remain seated when we break for lunch. Do not leave, okay? Thank you. Okay, so the Federal Reserve in the United States of America would understand banking and banking ecosystems and the like very well, and of course is very influential in the economic happenings of the United States of America. And we like to say when the United States catches a cold, we sneeze, and that is true. So it is fortuitous that we are going to have a special speaker, David Katuk, author and CIO and Cumberland Advisors and a GIC board member who's going to speak to us on the Fed and the flu.
Thank you very much, Zhivargo. Should I say all protocols observed? Being the last speaker after this extraordinary morning before lunch makes me think of the sixth husband of a Kardashian. I have 15 minutes, I know what I have to do, and I have to find a way to make it interesting. What you're going to hear in 15 minutes is a summary of a project that's been worked on for nearly 4 years. So my co-authors, Michael Anglin may be known to many in the US from Action Economics. We used his database and his graphics. Tristan did expert research in antiquity. And Elizabeth Sweet, Lisa Sweet, who has a distinguished career in literature, English, writing, and some service at Brookings, served as a co-author and an executive editor. This is a project that started after early COVID and the actions of the Federal Reserve. And I started to hear talking heads on television day after day after day criticizing the Fed. Now, the Federal Reserve has to make decisions in real time, and the easiest thing in the world is to criticize them afterward. That's fine. You want to play the football game on Monday, you know everything. You have to sit on the firing line. It's a different game. So that triggered a study. I have to advance it. There it is. No. Yeah. So the study was this. I started to see work from the Fed, and in one slide we're going to refer to a paper written by the three folks at the San Francisco Fed, which was very thoughtful. And I started to think about the history here. And the Federal Reserve's got 110 years of history. You think about its formation right before the Spanish flu and right after the Russian flu, which we don't really think about in the US, but it killed over 100,000 people in the UK 10 years before there was a meeting in Jekyll Island with some international bankers who knew about the Russian flu because they were global in their business. That was in the early stage. So if you look at the Federal Reserve and you say, what did they do during the Spanish flu? Nothing. They were worried about financial stability after the banking panic of 1907. That's how they came into existence. J.P. Morgan said, we can't do this again. And that's how the Fed was created. So I looked at that and I said, well, that's understandable. The reserve banks were in various cities. In the city of Philadelphia, at its worst day, 12,000 people died, and they were lying on the street from this infection. And the minutes of the meetings don't mention it. They were worried about financial stability. That was the early Fed. There was one action that I could find in the research. It was at the New York Fed. It affected, because of the Spanish flu, loans and credits. And there was a discussion in the minutes of the New York Fed that we have to do something because there are some problems referring to sickness. And so they decided they would open the discount window for a certain type of loan, but only to the federal member banks, not to the state banks. That was the early days of the Federal Reserve. I'm not faulting the Federal Reserve at all here. What has the Federal Reserve done? Well, it's experienced learning as an institution. Now, it had to deal with issues in the Asian flu and Hong Kong flu in the 50s or 60s. And we had a war going on twice in Korea and subsequently in Vietnam. And in the history of pandemics, you will find that war and disruption of government run parallel to epidemics and plagues. In our research for this book, which is going to be a book released, I hope, in April, we examined 314 identified plagues, epidemics, pandemics. They all have similar characteristics, including COVID. I want to get to the economics of it, so let me go quickly. This working paper is 2020-09. You can find it on the San Francisco Fed's website. And it's a marvelous study. I read it over and over and then read its entire bibliography. That was what triggered the expansion of this book. What did they find? They examined 19 pandemics defined as 100,000 dead or more. They used the Bank of England's database and what data they had from the Federal Reserve's database. The Bank of England has marvelous database. British professors have nothing to do. So they have the ability to have the deepest of research. And they write extraordinary papers, and it's a good thing, because then we can find them and read them. So the Bank of England database looked at 700 years of history in Europe. What did they find? In all 19 cases, after the initial shock, which could be 3 years or 4 years or 2 years or 9 years or 8 years, depending on what the disease was, there was the initial shock, wage inflation, spike, the destruction from a plague. What happens in the plague? People die. It's not a war. It's not a hurricane. You don't destroy capital stock. You reallocate it. The survivors get wealthier. The rich survivors get richer. Why? Because they inherit. They are the heirs. They survived, and they are in the line of the wealthy. The poor survivors maybe got a little better off, but they didn't have much to get to begin with. The population went down. So the per capita wealth went up. Now think about that. Per capita wealth goes up. What else happened? You had fewer people. So the least fallow field was allowed to be fallow. The least productive field was allowed to go fallow. We don't need that food anymore. What happened? Productivity went up. Now think about what I just said. Per capita wealth up, productivity up. What happens to inflation when those things happen? It goes down, not in the initial shock, in the medium term. So that's what these folks wrote in that study. They examined 19 pandemics. The results were the same, and they were able then to estimate the neutral real interest rate using a Wixellian model. That's a $2 word for economists. The neutral real interest rate, after all 19, pandemics in the medium term went down. Now, there's a bunch of studies right now. Some of them I know about, one of them in the Fed, which is looking at whether the neutral real interest rate will go up. And it might. But it also might go down. History says it's going to go down. We have watched, and in preparation for the book, what we did is we took the 19 studies and we said, can we find more evidence anywhere in history? And that's how we studied every single identified plague, starting with the first one 3,500 years ago. This is an artistic depiction of the plague that hit the Philistines. I want to get to the conclusion because I'm on limited time. Behavior was the same everywhere, in every plague, and it affected popularity. Zhivago said popularity of politicians. The behavior was affected all the time and everywhere, in every plague, from the entire human history where it's recorded. In the early stages, God was blamed for the plague. It took Thucydides in Athens, writing about the Peloponnesian War, to de-deify the plagues. Before that, it was Apollo's fault. And if Apollo liked you, he then lifted the plague and forgave you. And depending on where you looked around the world, that's what you found. Except things changed when we started to have some record of human history. But the behavior was always the same. In Milan in 1631, the governor heard about disease in Siena. So he sent two of his emissaries to Siena. What did they have to do those days? They had to get on a horse and ride over there. And he said, go look around and then come back and tell me what you find. And they come back. And this is written in the recorded minutes of the government, 1631. They came back and they say, there's people dead on the street, people dying. He says, we cannot tell the people. Keep it a secret. Keep it a secret, the governor says. And then he says, the rumors are going around. We need to relieve the worry of the people. Let's celebrate the new princess. And so he convenes a celebration of the new princess, and he has a super spreader, and in about 2 months, he's got dead people lying all over the street. History, history, history. What did the Fed do? At the time of SARS, the Fed was already starting research papers, actually a few years before, but it stepped up at the time of SARS. We didn't have SARS, but the thinking and preparation that this is an economic shock. It requires a policy response. The Fed knew how to respond during war. World War II, the Federal Reserve financed the war, disregarded the inflation rate, it set the interest rate, and it didn't change for 4 years. The Fed knew how to respond to shocks, but pandemic shocks were new. And all this criticism of the Federal Reserve ignores the learning that took place in this institution. Now, Chris Waller's sitting in the audience. He's heard me say this before, so full disclosure, he may buy me a beer tonight, but he can't pay for it. The truth is, learning took place in the institution, and so there was preparation, and therefore, in my opinion, the action of this central bank saved the world from a repeat of a depression. And the depression not only would have been deep in the United States, it would have been deep in the Bahamas and in 190 other countries. So the central bank of the world's reserve currency, if you look in its literature, was preparing and hoped never to have to do what it had to do. We had a shock. This is one of the charts from the book. The book has 50 charts. That's 50 pages. and 50 graphic discussions of each one, and a narrative in 3 sections about the Fed and its history, about modern history, and about antiquity, all the way back to the first record of the first epidemic. The first epidemic. Where was that? It was in the city of Megiddo, in the crossroads of the Golden Crescent at the time. So trade, which went from Cyprus to the Euphrates, went through, and the crossroads was at Megiddo in present-day Israel. And north-south trade that went from Turkey to Alexandria, the crossroads was in Megiddo. It just so happens I have been to the dig, the archaeological dig in Megiddo twice, and once shortly after the publication. And I'm looking at that history, and I said, wow, we know there's a plague because the king in Megiddo sent a note to the pharaoh, only had to chisel it in a rock. And he said, I need soldiers because so many of my soldiers are dead from the plague. First recorded words of a plague, 3,500 years ago. Pharaoh didn't send them the soldiers. You know why? He had the problem all over Egyptian hegemony. But what else did we find? We found the record that for 200 years after the plague, there was no new construction. The pottery shards that you would find in an archaeological dig that would identify a jug that came from Cyprus and was on its way to somewhere in the Euphrates stopped. Trade fell in half for 200 years. People were dead, but the capital stock was unchanged. Shocks. Another shock. A banking system shock. Here's where we're going to go with this. If history repeats itself, the form is different now. But in every case, you lost people that triggered innovation. The innovation took different forms. It was disruptive government every single time. And look around the world today, it sure looks like it. And following it was this period of low inflation, higher productivity, because the survivors had to survive. So the adaptation had to occur. Now, is the fallow field from antiquity the same as the empty commercial real estate in cities in the United States now? Is the change in working patterns to work from home, or the Zoom meeting that we just had, a change? Would these changes have occurred had we had no pandemic? Turn the clock back to 2009 or to 2019 and ask yourself, what would the world look like today? And what would the United States look like today? Well, there's one study that says 14 trillion of GDP didn't happen. Now, whether it's 14 or 13 or 15, I don't know. I don't think it makes a lot of difference. So if you look at the years 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023, and you add up the GDP, more or less, you get 103 trillion. What's a trillion here or there among friends? If you had 103 trillion in the pandemic shock period, and if the estimate is there's 14 that isn't there, what's the growth potential going forward? And what is the neutral real interest rate? And that's the most pressing, hard decision for every central banker, in my opinion, in the whole world. If history's right, in the medium term, after a pandemic shock, the disruptions that are taking place in government, and the reallocation of capital in a new, more productive form, If history's right, the neutral real interest rate will go down. And if you take a look at the study written in June or published in June of 2020, it'll go down by 150 basis points, more or less. Imagine what that means for world growth and productivity post-disruption, post-shock. So, if we're right and history repeats itself, we have the roaring 20s ahead of us in many countries. No inflation, an entirely new level of productivity, quality of life. And if we're wrong and the neutral real interest rate goes up, then we have to struggle with a debt burden that in real terms will be more difficult. And if you invite me back in 10 years, I'll tell you what happened. Thank you very much. I should add that we think the book and the ability to get it from Barnes & Noble and Amazon is probably in April. Originally, when I said to Jill I'd love to come to the Bahamas for 20 minutes for this, I thought it would be ready now. But all forecasts come with a caveat, and that one was wrong. So we hope in April you'll be able to get it if you want it. Thank you.